Three fur trappers walked out of the high country above the Skagit River in the autumn of 1893, and by the time they finished talking, the whole saloon had gone silent. These were not men who scared easy. They had spent 20 years in country that killed softer people. Frostbite, starvation, grizzlies, none of it had ever sent them running home. But that night, in a mining town that barely had a name, they stood up and told everyone in the room to pack their things and leave before dark, and they were not joking. What those three men found up in that valley did not fit anything in the history books. It still doesn't. And for more than 100 years, the record has done a very good job of making sure you never heard about it. Their names were Elias Crane, Thomas Body, and a younger man everyone just called Finch. Crane was the leader, in his 50s, a man who had trapped beaver and marten across the North Cascades since before Washington was even a state. Body was his oldest friend, slow to speak and slower to lie. Finch was a quiet kid from Ohio who had joined them 2 seasons earlier because he wanted to see the last wild edge of the country before the railroads swallowed it whole. By 1893, that edge was closing fast. The mountains were still enormous, still mostly unmapped, but the men who knew them were getting old, and the blank spaces on the maps were filling in. So that autumn, the three of them pushed further east than they had ever gone, chasing a rumor of untouched drainages, valleys so remote that no trapper had ever set a line there. What they were looking for was fur. What they found was something nobody has ever been able to explain. To understand why these men reacted the way they did, you have to understand who they were. Crane and Body had seen everything the wilderness could throw at a person. They had walked past the bones of settlers who froze in the passes. They had found abandoned native villages, old mining claims gone to rot, cabins with the roofs caved in. Ruins did not frighten them. Death did not frighten them. They had made a long career out of walking into places other men were too afraid to go. So when they came running back down out of that valley, white in the face, the people in town listened, because these were the last men on earth you would expect to scare. They had been following a river the local Skagit and Lackapamuck's people would not follow. That detail matters. The tribes of that region knew the mountains better than any surveyor ever would, and they had names and stories for nearly every peak and drainage. But this one valley they left alone. When Crane asked an older guide about the country up that particular fork, the man refused to take them, refused the money, and told them the valley did not belong to the living. Crane, being a practical man, assumed this was superstition. He was wrong. The three of them climbed for the better part of 2 days. The trees thinned out. The game vanished. Body noticed it first. The silence. No birds. No squirrels. No marten's sign, which for a trapper is like walking into a forest with no trees. The animals had left, or had never come, and the men could not agree on which was worse. Then they came over a ridge and saw the valley floor, and everything they thought they knew about that country came apart. Below them, half swallowed by earth and moss, was a city, not a village, not a mining camp, not the rotting cabins of some forgotten homesteader. Crane described what he saw in the only language he had, and the words he used in the town that night were the words of a man describing something he had no framework for. He talked about walls of cut stone, fitted so tightly he could not slide a knife blade between them. He talked about arches, domes, a great avenue running straight through the centre of it, paved in flat stone, wide enough for wagons to pass 4 abreast. And towers, tall, graceful towers, most of them broken now, their tops sheared off as if by some enormous hand. Understand what this means. In 1893, the accepted history of that region was simple. Native peoples had lived there for thousands of years in a way that left almost no permanent structures behind. The first white settlers had arrived only a few decades earlier. There was no lost empire in the Cascades. There was no ancient stone city with paved avenues and domed towers. Such a thing simply could not exist. And yet 3 sober, experienced men stood on that ridge and looked down at exactly that. Body thought at first they had wandered into some strange dream, that the altitude had gotten to them, but you cannot share a hallucination between 3 men. They all saw it. And the deeper they went, the stranger it got. The stone was the first impossibility. Crane had built with stone his whole life. He knew what it took to move a block the size of a man, let alone stack it. Down in that valley were blocks the size of freight cars, lifted and set into place with a precision he could not fathom. The edges were clean. The corners were sharp. Whoever built this had tools and methods that a frontier fur trapper had never seen and could not imagine. This was not the work of people scraping by in a hard land. This was the work of a civilization with engineering, with mathematics, with power. And then there was the question the men kept coming back to, the question that has haunted this story ever since. If a civilization capable of building all of this had lived in these mountains, where did they go? And why had every trace of them been scrubbed so completely from the record that 3 men could stumble onto an entire stone city and have no name for what they were looking at? They walked the main avenue. Finch, the youngest, went ahead. He found the great buildings along the central road were not empty. Inside, protected from the weather by walls that had stood for who knows how long, there were objects. Metalwork, green with age but intact. Vessels. Fixtures set into the walls that Crane swore were made to hold something. Lamps, maybe, or something like lamps, though there was no soot, no ash, no sign of fire ever having burned in them. The buildings had been lit somehow, and not by flame. This is the detail that turns the story from a ghost tale into something far more unsettling, because the men were not describing a primitive ruin. They were describing a place that had been advanced. A place with a technology their own world, the world of steam engines and gas lamps and the first flickering electric lights, had only just begun to reach for. And this place had reached it, and then vanished, long enough ago that a forest had grown up over the top of it, and the very people who lived nearby had forgotten it was anything but cursed ground. There was more. Finch, poking through the smaller buildings along the avenue, found what he could only describe as writing. Not letters he recognized, not any alphabet he had ever seen in a schoolbook or a Bible or a newspaper. Symbols carved deep into the stone above the doorways, flowing and geometric, repeating in patterns that felt deliberate, like a language that thousands of people had once read and written every day. He copied a few of them onto a scrap of oilcloth with a bit of charcoal. That scrap, if the accounts are to be believed, was one of the few things the men carried down out of the valley, and like everything else in this story, it eventually vanished. Nobody who ever claimed to have seen it managed to hold on to it. The men found no bodies. That was another thing that shook them. A city that large, and not a single grave, not a single skeleton, not one sign of the people who had walked those avenues. It was as if they had all simply gotten up and left, or as if something had taken them, all at once, and taken them clean. They should have turned back then. Crane later admitted as much. But there is a thing that happens to a man who finds something impossible. He needs to touch it, to prove to himself it is real. So they went into the largest structure, the domed building at the head of the avenue, and it is what happened inside that building that sent them running down the mountain and into that saloon, begging a town full of miners to leave before dark. Crane never gave the full account in public. Body would not speak of it at all after that first night. Only Finch talked, and only later, and only to a few people, and what he described does not sit easily even now. He said the great dome was not empty. He said there was a structure at its centre, a kind of ring or basin of dark metal, and that as the 3 of them stood near it in the fading afternoon light, it began to make a sound, low, steady, a hum they felt in their teeth and in the bones of their chest more than they heard it with their ears. He said the air changed. He said the fixtures in the walls, the ones with no soot and no flame, began to glow, faintly, a cold blue light rising in a building that had stood silent and dark for centuries. Whatever that place was, it was not fully dead. Something in it was still waiting, still working, and it had noticed them. They ran. 3 grown men who had faced down bears and blizzards ran down a mountain in the dark, falling, tearing their clothes, losing half their gear. They did not stop until they reached the town, and the first thing out of Crane's mouth, before he explained anything, was a warning. Get out of these mountains before the sun goes down, because whatever they had woken up in that valley, he was certain it was coming. Now, here is where the story does what these stories always seem to do. It disappears. There is no official record of a stone city in the North Cascades. No expedition was ever mounted, at least not one written into any archive the public can reach. The town Crane warned did not empty out. The miners, being miners, mostly laughed. A few went looking for the valley in the weeks that followed and found nothing, no ridge, no avenue, no towers, as if the whole place had folded back into the mountains. Crane and Body left the region entirely and never trapped those drainages again. Finch told his version to anyone who would listen, and was, of course, treated as a man who had lost his nerve and then his mind. Body never spoke of that night again. He died a few years later. Some said of drink, some said of something that had followed him down off the mountain, and the men who knew him best said he slept with a lamp burning until the day he passed. Crane went quiet too, and old before his time. Only Finch kept telling the story, out in the little towns, to anyone who would buy him a drink and sit still long enough to hear it, right up until the story stopped being a warning and became the thing that ruined him. He died poor and alone, insisting to the very last that every word of it was true, that the valley was still up there in the high country, and that whatever they had woken was still awake. And this is the part the Tartaria question forces you to sit with, because the pattern in this story is not unique. All across North America, all across the world, there are accounts like this one. Travelers and settlers in the 1800s describing enormous, advanced ruins that do not fit the accepted timeline. Star forts with geometry too perfect for the men supposedly building them. Grand buildings older than any city has a right to be. Structures with no clear architect and no clear purpose, later explained away, torn down, or buried, until the official story reads clean and simple and leaves no room for a stone city. 3 trappers swore they walked through. There is a word for what men like Crane may have walked into, though the word did not exist in his lifetime. The people who study these anomalies call it a reset. The idea is unsettling and simple. It says that not so very long ago, a civilization existed that was more advanced in certain ways than the one that replaced it, and that this civilization was buried, sometimes literally, under a wave of mud and silt and forgetting. They point to the old buildings that have been dug out of the ground in cities all over the world, the windows and doorways sunk halfway below the modern street, the first floors that were plainly built to be ground floors before something came and covered them over. They point to the star forts with their impossible geometry. They point to accounts exactly like this one, told by exactly these kinds of men. And they ask the same question the 3 trappers were asking on that ridge. If none of this ever happened, why does the evidence keep surfacing, and why is it always explained away so quickly and so neatly? The mainstream explanation is that these accounts are exaggeration, misremembering, folklore, the fog of the frontier. Maybe. But you are allowed to notice how consistent the fog is. You are allowed to notice that the same details keep surfacing, in different countries, in different decades, from people who never met and had no reason to lie. The perfect stone, the light without fire, the population that vanished all at once. The forgetting that follows, thorough and fast, and strangely convenient. What did Elias Crane, Thomas Body, and the young man called Finch actually find above the Skagit River in 1893? We will probably never know for certain. The valley, if it was ever real, has kept its secret. But the men who found it were not fools and were not cowards, and they staked their reputations on a warning that cost them everything and gained them nothing. Men like that do not run for no reason. Somewhere in those mountains, if the story is true, there may still be a domed building with a ring of dark metal at its heart, humming quietly in the dark, waiting for the next 3 people foolish enough to walk in and wake it up. And the history books still say there is nothing up there at all.